The screaming never seemed to end. Fern's cries echoed off the cold marble walls of the Cross mansion, each sound a hammer blow announcing a death sentence not yet carried out. In a place like this, silence was survival, and power was the only thing that could truly protect you. Stay with me to see if a desperate mother could find that protection in the most terrifying man alive. This story will show you that sometimes the people the world calls monsters are the ones who need love the most, and that true family is never about blood. It is about who chooses to stay when everything falls apart. Please, baby, please be quiet, Solene pleaded, her voice a raw whisper. She rocked her daughter against her chest, the fabric of her uniform damp with sweat and tears. For the last 40 minutes, her arms had burned with the strain of bouncing the 11-month-old girl, but her exhaustion meant nothing. When Fern decided to scream, the world had to listen. Suddenly, Mrs. Thornbury was at the far end of the long hall, her face a mask of pure terror. "Are you out of your mind?" the older woman hissed, her voice trembling. "He is in his office. He can hear every single sound." Solene's blood ran cold. She knew exactly who he was. Stellan Cross. They called him the Phantom, a man who had constructed an entire empire on the broken bodies of his enemies. She had accepted this job from the depths of her desperation. She was 4 months behind on rent, buried under a mountain of medical bills from Fern's early birth, and haunted by an abusive ex who had simply vanished, leaving behind nothing but debts and bruises. There had been no other choice. "I looked for someone to watch her, I swear," Solene whispered, hot tears stinging her eyes as they welled up. "My nanny had an emergency. I must have called everyone I know. There is nobody left to call." Mrs. Thornbury took a step back. "You will not have a life left if he—" The words caught and died in the housekeeper's throat. Somewhere deep within the mansion, a heavy door slammed shut. Then came the sound of footsteps. They were slow, measured, and they were getting closer with each deliberate step. "Run," Mrs. Thornbury mouthed silently, before she vanished around a corner as if she were a ghost. But Solene was frozen in place. Her legs felt like they had been poured from solid concrete. All she could do was stand there, clutching her wailing child, as Stellan Cross emerged from the hallway and came to a halt. He was so much taller than she had pictured, with shoulders that seemed to block out the light. A brutal scar carved a path down the left side of his face, a pale, jagged line running from his temple all the way to his jaw. His eyes were the color of a frozen lake in winter, and they held just as much life. The black suit he wore must have cost more than she would make in an entire year. Then she saw it. There was fresh blood staining the knuckles of his right hand. When he spoke, his voice was so soft it was terrifying. Solene flinched as if he had screamed at her. "I am so sorry, sir," she began, the words tumbling out in a panicked rush. "I know I should not have brought her here. The nanny had an emergency. I could not find a replacement, and I cannot afford to miss work, sir. My daughter, she needs her medicine, and I—" His quiet command cut through her frantic explanation. "Stop talking." Celine's mouth clicked shut instantly. Fern, however, continued to shriek, her little body shaking with the force of her own cries. Stellan's icy gaze drifted down from Solene to the screaming baby in her arms. For a fraction of a second, an emotion she could not possibly identify flickered across his scarred face. "How old?" he asked. 11 months, sir. She was born very premature. She had to stay in the hospital for 2 months after she was born. She is terrified of strangers. She will not allow anyone but me to hold her. The doctors have to give her something to calm her down just for a checkup. She is afraid of absolutely everyone." Solene knew she was rambling, but she couldn't stop. "I am telling you this because—" Stellan raised his hand, reaching slowly toward Fern. Solene's heart hammered against her ribs. "Sir, please do not. She will only scream louder. You will make it so much worse. I am begging you, please just let me go. I will leave now, and I promise I will never bring her here again. I will find another way." And then all at once, Fern's crying stopped. The abrupt silence was so absolute it felt like the world had stopped turning. Solene forgot to breathe. Her daughter slowly lifted her head from her mother's shoulder, her large blue eyes, still shimmering with tears, fixed on Stellan Cross with a strange and powerful focus. And then, the impossible happened. Fern smiled. Celine felt a wave of dizziness. Her daughter had never, not once in her entire 11 months of life, smiled at a person she did not know. But she was smiling now, a wide, happy grin aimed directly at this terrifying man. She began reaching for him with both of her little arms, her tiny fingers opening and closing in a grabbing motion. "No," Celine whispered in disbelief. "Baby, no! What are you doing?" Fern let out a small whine and began to struggle in her mother's arms, fighting to get closer to Stellan. Her small body strained forward, her hands reaching out with pure desperation. She wanted to be held by him, this monster, this killer. Her daughter wanted this man to hold her. "Give her to me," Stellan said, his voice flat and unreadable. "Sir, no, please." But Soline found herself obeying. Perhaps it was the deep-seated fear he inspired. Perhaps it was the undeniable certainty in his command. Or perhaps it was the way Fern was looking at him, as if he were the only truly safe harbor in a violent storm. She placed her child into the arms of the most dangerous man in Chicago. And Fern, the same baby who screamed inconsolably and was terrified of everyone, immediately wrapped her arms around Stellan Cross's thick neck. She let out a long, deep sigh of perfect contentment. The infamous Mafia boss stood completely still, as if turned to stone. His bloodied hand hovered in the air beside the baby's back, uncertain of where to land. His cold, lifeless eyes had gone wide with shock. For one breathtaking, impossible moment, he looked vulnerable. He looked human. "She has never, ever done that before," Celine breathed out, the words barely audible. "Not with anyone." Stellan did not reply. He just stood there, holding this fragile, trusting life against his powerful chest, looking like a man who had just been handed a piece of his own soul and had no idea what to do with it. This was the exact moment that changed everything. If you felt that impossible shift, you have to hit the like button and share this story now. And make sure you subscribe, because you do not want to miss what happens next. It seems that sometimes, the most dangerous hands in the world are the safest place you can fall. Without another word, Stellan turned and walked away, not even glancing back to see Soline's reaction. Fern's arms were still clinging to him. She held on tightly around his neck. Her big blue eyes were closed, and her breathing was deep and even. She looked as though she had finally found the one place in the world she was meant to be. Soline remained frozen for a long second, her mind completely unable to process the scene unfolding before her. Then, her feet began to move on their own, her body following the man who carried her daughter away as if this were the most normal thing imaginable. They proceeded down a long, cavernous hallway, passing priceless oil paintings and enormous, perfectly arranged bouquets of flowers. Each one of Stellan's footsteps made a solid, confident sound on the polished marble floor. In contrast, each of Soline's steps was a quiet, trembling echo behind him. He pushed open a set of massive double oak doors, and Soline found herself stepping into another universe entirely. Stellan Cross's office was larger than the entire shabby apartment she and Fern called home. The ceiling was impossibly high, with a huge, glittering crystal chandelier hanging from its center. Towering floor-to-ceiling windows offered a breathtaking panoramic view of the Chicago skyline. The skyscrapers glittered against the dark sky like a forest made of diamonds. The dark walnut floor was so highly polished that Soline could clearly see her own terrified reflection staring back up at her. A gigantic desk made of black mahogany dominated the center of the room, holding only a sleek laptop and a single antique lamp. One entire wall was covered by a massive bookshelf, filled with leather-bound books that looked ancient and untouched. But it was not the sheer luxury of the room that made Soline's breath catch in her throat. In the far corner stood a tall glass cabinet that stretched from the floor almost to the ceiling. Inside, displayed on mounts of black velvet, were at least 20 different firearms. There were handguns and rifles, and other weapons whose names she did not even know. They gleamed menacingly under the soft lights, each one maintained with the same care a museum would give to a priceless piece of art. Solene swallowed against a dry throat. This was his world, a place built on blood and violence and death, and her precious daughter was sleeping soundly in the arms of the man who was its king. "Sit down," Stellan commanded, tipping his chin toward a black leather chair. It was placed directly opposite the massive desk. Solene sat. It was not a request she could refuse. Stellan moved around the desk, one powerful arm still cradling Fern securely against his chest. He lowered his large frame into his own chair, then carefully adjusted the baby's position with a strange, unexpected gentleness. He settled her head comfortably on his shoulder, his big hand covering almost the entirety of Fern's small back. The dried blood on his knuckles smeared against the dark, expensive fabric of his suit. He did not seem to notice or care. Stellan's cold gray eyes locked onto Solene. In the brighter light of the office, she could see the scar on his face with perfect clarity. It was a jagged, brutal line of pale tissue that told a story of terrible violence she could not begin to imagine. His voice, when he finally spoke, was still dangerously calm. "You are going to explain to me," he said slowly, "why you thought bringing a child into my home was an acceptable decision." Solene took a shaky breath. Every instinct screamed at her to lie, to invent a story that sounded less pathetic, but she could not. Those gray eyes were looking straight into her, as if they could see every secret she had ever kept. It felt as if he could read every single thought inside her head. In that moment, she knew that lying to this man would be the very last mistake she would ever make in her life. "My daughter's babysitter called me at 5 o'clock this morning," she began, her voice hoarse with exhaustion and fear. "Her mother had a stroke. She had to get on a plane to Florida right away. I made 17 phone calls, 17 different people." He cut in, his eyes never leaving her face. "Why? Why could none of them help you?" The question was sharp, like a blade. "Because I do not have anyone," Solene confessed, feeling her voice crack with emotion. "My parents died in a car crash when I was 16 years old. I do not have any brothers or sisters, no other relatives. All of my friends, they stopped calling a long time ago because—" She hesitated, the shame washing over her. "Because what?" he pressed. "Because of my ex-boyfriend," Solene whispered, staring down at her hands, which were clenched into tight fists in her lap. "He did not like it when I had friends. He did not like me speaking to anyone. He did not like me doing anything at all unless he said it was okay." A thick, heavy silence filled the vast office. When Solene finally dared to look up, she saw that something in Stellan's gaze had shifted. The coldness was still there, but now something else was there with it. Something much darker was now lurking in their depths. It was a dangerous, predatory glint. "He hit you." It was not a question. It was a statement of fact from a man who understood violence intimately. Solene could only nod, her throat closing up with painful memories. "For 2 years," she whispered. "I was too afraid to leave because he promised he would kill me. Then, I discovered I was pregnant." Her eyes flickered to Fern, who was still sleeping so peacefully on Stellan's shoulder, completely unaware of the ugly past her mother was now exposing to the light. "He beat me when I was 7 months pregnant," she continued, her voice trembling. "He beat me so badly that I ended up in the hospital. That is why she was born 2 months early. She weighed less than 2 kilograms. The doctors told me she probably would not survive." Solene's voice broke on a sob. "Fern spent 62 days in an incubator. For 62 endless days, I sat by her side, praying and begging any god who would listen to please let my baby live. And while I was doing that, he was gone. He just disappeared. He left me with all of his gambling debts, which were in my name. He left me with all of the hospital bills. He left me with an eviction notice for 4 months of unpaid rent." Silent tears streamed down Solene's face. but she had no strength left to wipe them away. Away every last piece of her pride. She was simply too exhausted to fight for her dignity anymore. Fern was born premature, which means her immune system is dangerously weak. She depends on medication to stay healthy. She requires constant doctor visits. These are all things that I do not have the money for. I lost 3 different jobs because I had to take time off to look after her whenever she fell ill. This position, she lifted her head, her gaze locking directly with Stellan's. This job was the very last hope I had. If I am fired from this, my daughter and I will be forced to live on the streets. So, yes, I was fully aware that bringing her here was a reckless, desperate act. I knew exactly who you are. I understood that you could end my life for this minor inconvenience, but I truly had no other option. When my choices were a definite firing or a possibility of being killed, I took the chance. I chose the possibility, because at least with that, there was a tiny sliver of hope. Celine's words stopped, her breaths coming in quick, shallow gasps. She had revealed too much, and she was acutely aware of it. But the moment she started talking, the dam inside her broke, and she could not stop the flood. Everything she had kept locked away for almost 2 years came pouring out. The entire office was plunged into a heavy silence. Stellan remained completely still and said nothing at all. He just continued to watch her, his expression completely unreadable. One of his arms still cradled Fern, and his thumb was subconsciously stroking small circles on the child's back. In her sleep, Fern began to stir. She made a soft murmuring noise and then instinctively tightened her small arms around Stellan's neck, seeking comfort. Celine witnessed something then, just for a fleeting moment. As Stellan looked down at the small child resting in his arms, his intense gaze softened. The ice that usually coated his features melted away for just a fraction of a second before it returned, colder than before. "What is his name?" Stellan's voice was a low growl, a terrifying sound that sent a shiver down her spine. "The man who put you through all of this. What is his name?" Celine went rigid. She instantly knew that his question was not born from simple curiosity. It was a vow. It was a promise of brutal violence, a guarantee of retribution, and of terrible things that would surely happen if she gave him an answer. Celine just shook her head, her eyes wide. "It doesn't make a difference," she said, her words rushing out. "He is gone. I have no idea where he is, and honestly, I have no desire to ever know." Stellan observed her for a long, tense moment, his gray eyes as sharp as newly honed blades. Celine had the deeply unsettling feeling that he did not believe a word she was saying, or at the very least, that he understood she was concealing a larger truth. But he chose not to push her for more information. Not at that moment. He rose to his feet, still holding Fern as if the little girl weighed nothing more than a feather pillow. He slowly walked over to the massive window, staring out at the sprawling city that glittered with countless lights far below them. Fern shifted again in his arms, her head nudging against him as she searched for a more comfortable position on his broad shoulder, and then she settled back into a deep, peaceful sleep. For nearly a full 60 seconds, Stellan stood there in complete silence. Celine did not dare to make a sound. She hardly dared to breathe. She just sat there in the chair, waiting for him to deliver her sentence. She had prepared herself for being fired. She had even prepared herself for something far worse. "You and the child will be moving in here." Celine was absolutely convinced she had heard him wrong. "What was that? What did you just say?" "There is a private apartment located in the east wing of my estate," Stellan explained, his back still turned to her. "It has 2 bedrooms and comes completely furnished. You will move your things in this afternoon." Celine jumped out of her chair, her heart hammering against her ribs like a runaway drum. "Sir, I am sorry, but I do not understand. What are you telling me?" "I am telling you that you are going to live here," Stellan said, finally turning to face her, his expression as cold and unyielding as stone. I will arrange for a professional nanny to look after the child during the hours you are working. I will also take care of all her medical expenses, and you will no longer have to concern yourself with paying rent. Celine felt the entire room begin to tilt and spin around her. Nothing about this situation made any sense at all. Powerful men like Stellan Cross never offered help to anyone unless there was a hidden motive, unless they expected something in return. Why? She finally managed to ask, her voice trembling with confusion and fear. Why would you do all of this for me? You know absolutely nothing about me. I am just a cleaner. I cannot understand your reason for this. It is because of the child, Stellan interrupted, his gaze shifting down to the sleeping form of Fern. She has placed her trust in me. She should not trust me. Nobody should ever trust me. But for some reason, she does. He paused for a beat, his thumb resuming its gentle, absent-minded motion across the child's back. That is a feeling I am not accustomed to. Celine was at a complete loss for words. She simply stood there, watching the most feared and powerful man in all of Chicago hold her little girl with a kind of gentleness she had never witnessed from anyone before, not even from Fern's own father. But I cannot possibly accept this, she finally said. I do not want to be in your debt. I do not want to feel like I owe you. This is not an offer you are making. Stellan took a step toward her, and Celine had to use all her willpower not to retreat from him. He came to a stop directly in front of her, his large frame towering over her by almost a full foot, his shadow engulfing her like a dark, ominous cloud. You do not possess the right to refuse me. A surge of anger coursed through Celine's veins, momentarily overpowering her fear. Then what does that make me? She challenged, her voice coming out stronger and harsher than she had intended. Am I just some piece in one of your elaborate games? Am I just something else you can purchase with your money? Because I am not for sale. You are a mother who is starving herself so that her daughter has enough food to eat, Stellan cut her off, his voice sharp and laced with ice. You are a woman who gets by on 3 hours of sleep a night because she is forced to work 2 different jobs. You are someone who was desperate enough to stand before me, to stand in the face of death itself, because there were no other choices left for you. He tilted his head slightly, his eyes examining her with an unnerving intensity. I am not trying to buy you. I am presenting you with an opportunity. Whether you choose to accept it is ultimately up to you. But if you decline this because of some foolish sense of pride while your daughter is in desperate need of medicine, then that makes you worse than any of the men I have put in the ground. The harsh words felt like a physical blow, striking Celine across the face. She desperately wanted to scream at him, to tell him that she did not need his pity or anyone else's. But just then, Fern stirred again, letting out a small, contented sigh in her sleep, and every last bit of pride Celine had left crumbled into dust. She gazed at her daughter, at her fragile little child, so pale and thin. She was sick so often because Celine could not provide the proper medication. Her child slept on a worn-out mattress in a drafty apartment because Celine could not afford to pay for the heating. This child deserved so much more than a life of struggle, more than Celine could ever give her on her own. All right, Celine whispered, her voice cracking with emotion. I will stay, but I am doing this for Fern. Only for her. Stellan gave a slow nod, as if he had never considered any other possibility. Mrs. Thornberry will escort you to the apartment, he said. Your personal belongings will be collected and delivered within the next 2 hours. The new nanny is scheduled to begin tomorrow. He glanced down at Fern one last time. For just a brief, unguarded instant, Celine saw a flicker of something soft pass through his cold, gray eyes. And now, he said, his voice softer, let the child continue to sleep. She appears to like it here. This was not an apartment. It was far more than that. It was the kind of fantasy Celine had only ever allowed herself to dream about. Mrs. Thornberry guided her through a heavy oak door and Celine had to lean her hand against the wall to support herself, afraid her legs might give out. The living room was immense, furnished with luxurious cream-colored velvet sofas, plush fur rugs on the floor, and enormous windows that offered a stunning view of the estate's perfectly manicured gardens. The open-plan kitchen contained a refrigerator that was completely stocked with food, the kind of nourishing food Celine had not been able to purchase in months. There was fresh fruit, cartons of whole milk, and packages of beef. She had to quickly turn her head away, hoping Mrs. Thornbury would not notice the tears welling in her eyes. The main bedroom featured a large double bed made up with pristine white sheets and a feather duvet so thick and inviting that Celine had the sudden urge to collapse onto it and weep. But it was the second bedroom that finally shattered her composure. It was Fern's room. The walls were painted a gentle, pale mint green, adorned with hand-painted butterflies and flowers that seemed to flutter around the window frame. In the corner stood a beautiful white crib, complete with a cushioned mattress and soft, warm blankets. The shelves along the wall were overflowing with stuffed animals, colorful wooden stacking blocks, and soft cloth books designed for infants. When she opened the wardrobe, she found rows of tiny outfits hanging neatly inside. There were dresses, rompers, socks, and hats, all of them brand new, and all of them in exactly Fern's size. "He had all of this prepared," Mrs. Thornbury said, her voice softer and warmer than Celine had ever heard it before. Just 2 hours later, Celine was standing in the center of that beautiful room, silent tears streaming down her face. Her mind went back to her old, cold apartment, where Fern had to sleep on a thin, lumpy mattress on the hard floor. She remembered layering 3 old, threadbare blankets over her daughter because she could not afford to turn on the heat. She recalled all the long nights she spent lying awake, listening to her baby's soft cries from the cold, feeling like the most inadequate mother in the entire world. And now she was here, in this room, surrounded by this incredible warmth and comfort. She had no idea what she was supposed to be feeling. It was a confusing mix of overwhelming gratitude and profound fear. A soft knock on the front door startled Celine out of her thoughts. She hastily wiped the tears from her cheeks and went to open it. A woman of Asian descent stood on the doorstep. Celine guessed she was in her 40s, with her dark hair pulled back into a neat bun at the base of her neck. Her face was serene, but her eyes were as sharp and observant as a hawk's. She was dressed in a simple, practical black outfit, yet the way she held herself, the careful way she surveyed her surroundings, felt anything but ordinary. "I am Miss Hayashi," the woman said, her voice both gentle and firm. "I will be Fern's nanny, and I am scheduled to start tomorrow. Mr. Cross requested that I come and introduce myself to you beforehand." Celine motioned for her to come inside, still trying to get a sense of this mysterious woman. Miss Hayashi entered the apartment with the quiet, graceful alertness of a jungle cat, her sharp eyes methodically scanning every corner as if she were searching for a hidden threat. "Do you have much experience taking care of children?" Celine asked, needing some reassurance. "I have a great deal of experience with many different things," Miss Hayashi answered, a very faint, knowing smile gracing her lips. "You have no reason to be concerned. I can assure you that Fern will be completely safe with me." The specific way she emphasized the word safe sent a strange chill through Celine. It was not a chill of fear, but one of sudden, dawning realization. Miss Hayashi was not just a nanny. She was something far more. That night, after she fed Fern and gently placed her into the new, comfortable crib, sleep was impossible, as Celine lay in the strange, luxurious bed. The entire day felt like a dream she could not process. That morning, she was a cleaner, one complaint away from being fired and homeless. Tonight, she rested on silk sheets so fine she was afraid to touch them. This is what power looks like, she thought, the ability to protect someone. A soft noise from the hallway snapped her to attention. Footsteps stopped right outside her apartment. Listen carefully now. Celine slid from the bed without a sound, her body tense as she crept to the door. She did not dare to open it. Instead, She peered through the tiny peephole, and her breath caught in her throat. It was Stellan Cross. He was just standing there in the dim light, not making a move to knock or call out. He simply stared at her door, his expression a complete mystery. His hand started to lift, as if to knock, but then it dropped to his side. It rose again, only to fall once more. For almost 5 long minutes he remained frozen in this strange ritual before he finally spun around and vanished into the shadows of the corridor. Celine slumped against the door, her heart hammering against her ribs. She had no idea what that powerful man wanted from her. She could not comprehend why he would stand guard outside her room in the dead of night. But she understood one thing with absolute certainty. Her life was now permanently and irrevocably altered. The first week unfolded like a bizarre fantasy, one Celine was not entirely sure she ever wanted to end. Her responsibilities were transformed overnight. She no longer scrubbed floors or polished glass surfaces. Mr. Thornberry gave her a small, quiet desk in the estate's office wing. Her new duties involved organizing sensitive documents, sorting private mail, and learning the complex inner workings of the Cross family empire. The labor was not hard on her body, but it demanded an intense mental focus. Every single piece of paper she touched could contain a dangerous secret. Every name she read could belong to someone whose life hung in the balance. She quickly learned the unspoken rules: do not ask why, do not stare, and never show any curiosity about the hushed, serious meetings that happened behind Stellan's locked office doors. But the work was not what occupied her thoughts. It was the evenings. Every single night, precisely at 7 o'clock, never a minute early or a minute late, a firm knock would sound at her door, and every time Celine answered it, she found Stellan Cross waiting on the other side. He offered no explanations for his presence. He never requested entry. The man would simply step over the threshold, walk directly to her daughter Fern, and take a seat beside the little girl. He stayed for exactly 15 minutes, every single evening, without fail. On the very first night, Celine stood frozen in a corner of the room, her entire body rigid with anxiety and suspicion. She did not know how to act or what to say, but her daughter, Fern, knew exactly what to do. The instant the child laid eyes on Stellan, her brilliant blue eyes sparkled with joy. She scrambled toward him on her little legs as quickly as she could, her arms reaching up, asking to be held. And Stellan, known throughout Chicago as its most ruthless mafia boss, bent down and scooped her into his arms as if it were the most normal thing imaginable. Fern immediately wrapped her small arms around his thick neck, rested her head on his shoulder, and began to make soft, happy cooing sounds. Stellan was a man of few words during these visits. He might ask if the child was eating properly or getting enough sleep, but the short questions were always directed at Celine, while his intense gaze remained fixed on Fern. Mostly, he just sat there, holding the child, allowing Fern to tug on his expensive tie or gently pat his cheek with her tiny hand. On the third night of this ritual, Fern actually drifted off to sleep while resting on Stellan's shoulder. He sat perfectly still for more than 20 minutes, not making a single move, barely even breathing, terrified that the slightest shift might wake her. When he eventually rose to place Fern into her crib, his movements were impossibly gentle. Celine found it hard to believe these were the same hands rumored to have ended lives. Whispers began to circulate through the estate's staff like a spreading fire. Celine overheard them in the kitchens and saw them in the shocked expressions of servants she passed in the hallways. "He goes to see the child every night," one maid whispered in disbelief. "I cannot believe it. Whose baby is that, for him to show so much concern? It cannot be his." "Just the cleaner's daughter," another answered. "But you should see how she holds on to him, as if he were her own father." Only Mrs. Thornberry seemed unfazed by the development. "In the 20 years I have worked for the Cross family, I have never witnessed anything like this," she confided to Celine on the 5th day, while they were organizing files. "He has never liked children. In fact, he does not like anyone. getting too close to him. But Fern, Mrs. Thornberry trailed off, shaking her head with a look that was both confused and fascinated. That little girl has some kind of effect on him. I do not know what it is, but he becomes a different person around her. Celine had no idea what to say, because she was seeing the transformation herself. During the evenings when Stellan held Fern, the harsh lines of his face would soften. It was not a huge change, just a subtle easing of his defenses. It was enough for Celine to catch a glimpse of the real man hidden beneath the icy exterior. It was enough to make her wonder about who he truly was. On the seventh night, just as Stellan was about to leave, Fern started to wail. She grabbed onto the fabric of his jacket with her tiny fists, refusing to let him go as big tears streamed down her plump cheeks. Stellan just stood there, completely powerless, gazing down at the sobbing child with a look Celine had never witnessed on him before. It was a mixture of confusion and raw pain, as if Fern's crying was physically tearing him apart inside. "I will be back," he said to the little girl, his voice sounding more gravelly than usual. "I promise I will be back tomorrow." Fern could not understand the words, but she clearly understood his tone. Her crying subsided into a few soft hiccups, and she lifted her hand to touch his face. Stellan squeezed his eyes shut for a single fleeting moment, but that 1 second conveyed more emotion than any words possibly could. After he departed that evening, Celine stood by her window, watching his powerful form disappear down the corridor. She thought about Mrs. Thornberry's observation about the change in him, about the vulnerable man hidden inside the feared Mafia boss. And for the very first time since arriving at the estate, she felt an emotion that was not fear. It was something much more perilous, genuine curiosity. On the 9th night, Celine's deepest fears became a terrifying reality. She was jolted awake at 2 in the morning by a faint cry from the adjacent room. It was not Fern's usual cry for attention. This sound was different. It was a weak, pained whimper. Celine bolted from her bed and rushed into her daughter's room, where her heart plummeted into a cold, dark abyss. Fern was lying in her crib, her face a frightening shade of red, her fine hair completely matted with sweat. When Celine laid a hand on her forehead, a scream nearly escaped her lips. She was burning, so incredibly hot. "No, please, not this," Celine whispered, her hands trembling uncontrollably as she carefully lifted her daughter from the crib. Fern let out a feeble cry, her head lolling against her mother's chest as her small body was racked with shivers. Her breathing was rapid and shallow, each gasp feeling like a tiny knife twisting in Celine's own heart. She had witnessed this exact scene before, in the sterile environment of a hospital intensive care unit right after Fern was born. She remembered the worried looks on the doctors' faces as they bustled around. A compromised immune system, they had told her back then. A simple fever that would be a minor issue for a healthy child could be a death sentence for Fern. Celine clutched her daughter even tighter, hot tears of terror streaming down her face. She had no money for an ambulance. She had no health insurance. She had absolutely no one to turn to for help. "You are going to be all right, my love," she whispered, unsure if she was trying to comfort Fern or herself. "Mommy will figure something out. Mommy always does." Suddenly, the bedroom door was thrown open with incredible force. She spun around, her heart seizing with shock. Stellan Cross filled the doorway, his dark hair a mess and his shirt deeply creased, looking as if he had launched himself directly out of bed. His intense gray eyes scanned the room, finally locking onto Fern, and a dangerous, protective fire ignited in their depths. "What is wrong?" His voice was as sharp and cold as a razor's edge. "She has a fever," Celine managed to say, her own voice cracking with panic. "A very high one. I do not know what to do. I have no money to call a doctor. Before she could even finish her sentence, Stellan had his phone out. He quickly dialed a number and spoke only 4 words into it. "Get here right now." He ended the call and strode towards Celine. "Give her to me." Celine did not pause for even a second. She transferred Fern into his strong arms, and the child's desperate cries immediately ceased. Her breathing was still fast, and her skin was still scorching hot, but she was no longer crying, as if just being held by Stellan made the pain manageable. "The doctor will be here in 15 minutes, Stellan stated, his gaze fixed on Fern. "He is my personal physician, the very best in Chicago. She is going to be fine." He said it with the force of a command, as if he were ordering the universe itself to leave this child alone. 12 minutes later, a professional middle-aged man with a medical bag arrived. He conducted a quick and thorough examination of Fern, diagnosed a mild respiratory infection, and administered the first dose of medication. He explained how to keep the fever down. "For a normal child, this would not be serious," he said, "but with her fragile immune system, she requires constant monitoring. I will come back first thing in the morning." After the doctor departed, Celine released a breath she did not realize she had been holding. But Stellan did not leave. He settled into the chair next to Fern's crib, still holding the child, and turned his gaze to Celine. "Go and get some sleep," he ordered. "I will stay and watch over her." Celine immediately shook her head. "I cannot possibly sleep. She is sick. I need to be here." "You have to rest," Stellan interrupted, his tone leaving no room for negotiation. "You are on the verge of collapsing from exhaustion. You will be no help to her if you make yourself sick." She wanted to argue with him, but she knew deep down that he was right. She was utterly spent, both physically and emotionally. She had not had a proper night's sleep in months, maybe even years. And now, seeing Stellan sitting there with Fern resting safely in his arms, his expression serious and focused, she experienced a feeling she had not known in a very long time. She felt safe. She did not leave the room. She could not bring herself to go that far. Instead, she slid down to the floor, rested her back against the cool wall, and finally allowed herself to drift into an exhausted sleep while the city's most dangerous man kept a vigilant watch over her precious daughter. When she awoke, the soft, early morning light was just beginning to filter through the curtains. Stellan was still in the chair, in the exact same position. He had not moved all night long. Fern was sleeping peacefully on his chest, her breathing much more even now, and a healthy color was returning to her cheeks. And Stellan, with dark shadows of exhaustion under his eyes, was looking down at the sleeping child with an expression that Celine could not quite decipher. It was a mix of tenderness, fierce protection, and a deep, aching pain, as if he were staring at something beautiful and precious that he knew he could never deserve. "Do not you dare give up, little one," he whispered, unaware that Celine was awake and listening. "You are so much stronger than you know. You have to be." His voice hitched for a fraction of a second before he regained his composure, and Celine, sitting in the quiet dawn, felt silent tears stream down her face. But for the first time, they were not tears of fear. They were tears of something else entirely. She was witnessing a moment that perhaps no one else on earth ever had. She was watching the heart of Stellan Cross break. It took Fern a full 3 days to recover completely. During those 3 days, Stellan visited not just once, but twice each day, arriving in the morning and again in the evening to personally check on the little girl's condition. For 3 long days, his private physician was constantly available, providing costly medicines Celine knew she could never dream of affording on her own. And for those 3 days, she began to see this powerful, feared man in an entirely new light. On the 4th morning, when Fern was finally able to smile and play once more, Stellan had Celine called to his main office. She stood rigidly in front of his massive desk, her spine a straight line, fighting to project an image of calm even as her heart hammered against her ribs. She had no idea what he wanted from her. Perhaps he had grown weary of their arrangement. Maybe he was finally going to tell her to leave. "You see things," Stellan stated suddenly, his voice slicing through her anxious thoughts. Celine blinked in confusion. "Sir?" she asked. "Yesterday, while the doctor was examining Fern, you were standing in the corner of the room." Stellan got up from his chair and walked over to the large window, presenting his back to her. "Tell me what you saw." At first, Celine did not grasp what he was asking. but she dutifully replayed the entire scene in her memory. She saw the doctor tending to Fern, she saw herself watching nervously, and then she focused on the small details she had registered. He was anxious, she said, choosing her words carefully. But not about Fern. He was worried about something entirely different. He kept glancing down at his watch. His hand had a slight tremor when he was writing out the prescription for her. And as he was leaving, he looked back toward the main gate, almost as if he was afraid someone was out there waiting for him. Stellan turned around to face her, his gray eyes piercing and sharp like polished steel. "What else did you notice?" Celine paused for a brief moment before continuing. His phone vibrated in his pocket 3 separate times during the examination. He never answered it, but after each vibration, his eyes would dart toward the door. "The very last time, I saw him swallow hard, like he was genuinely frightened." A heavy silence filled the room. Stellan observed her with an intense expression she could not begin to interpret. Then, he gave a slow, deliberate nod, a faint smile just barely touching his lips. "That doctor has significant gambling debts," he explained. "He is being pressured by loan sharks. I discovered this information last week, but you figured it out in 10 minutes just by watching him." Celine was speechless and did not know what to say. She remained perfectly still, waiting for him to continue. "You are incredibly intelligent," Stellan went on, taking a step closer to her. "You managed to survive for 2 years with a man who abused you. You raised a child entirely by yourself with absolutely no resources. You stood your ground in front of me when every other person on this estate is terrified of me." He came to a stop directly in front of her. He was now close enough that she could see the sharp, defined angles of his face and the thin scar that ran from his temple all the way down to his jawline. "I am in need of an assistant," he stated plainly. "Not the type who simply organizes paperwork. I need someone who can read people, someone who can sense a threat before it materializes, and someone who can think clearly under immense pressure." The room began to feel unsteady, and Celine felt a wave of dizziness. "You want me to be your assistant? I will train you myself," Stellan said, his tone making it clear this was not a negotiation. "You are going to learn how to analyze people, how to detect lies, and how to break down complex situations. You will attend my meetings and tell me exactly what you observe. Your pay will be 5 times what you are earning now, and Fern will be provided with absolutely everything she ever needs." A part of Celine desperately wanted to refuse. She wanted to tell him she had no desire to be pulled any deeper into his dangerous world. But then she thought about Fern. She thought of all the sleepless nights when her child was sick and the deeply uncertain future that awaited them if Celine had no power or resources of her own. Then she thought of Stellan, the very man who had stayed up through the night, holding her sick daughter in his arms. The man who had whispered to Fern as if she were the most valuable treasure in the entire world. "Very well," she finally said, her voice surprisingly firm and steady. "I accept your offer." Stellan nodded once, as if he had never had any doubt about what her answer would be. "We will begin tomorrow morning." As Celine walked out of his office, she had the distinct feeling that she had just stepped over a threshold and could never go back. The next 2 weeks passed in a blur of intense lessons and constant observation. Stellan personally taught Celine how to interpret body language, how to notice the most subtle tells of deception, and how to distinguish between genuine fear and the behavior of someone hiding something much more sinister. He had her watch recordings of his previous business meetings, instructing her to provide a detailed analysis of every single person in the room. She was a natural, learning far more quickly than he had ever anticipated. So in the 3rd week, he decided it was time for a real-world test. The meeting was held in the estate's primary conference room. There were 5 men seated around a long, polished table made of black mahogany. One was a real estate developer from New York named Morrison, accompanied by his 2 lawyers. The other 2 men were strangers to Celine, but her instincts told her they were representatives of some kind of powerful organization. She took a seat in the corner of the room with a notebook and pen, having been introduced merely as Mr. Cross's new secretary. As expected, nobody gave her a second glance. This was precisely the advantage Stellan was counting on. Celine observed everything in complete silence as the developer, Morrison, began his presentation on a luxury housing development planned for the suburbs of Chicago. He was a man in his middle years, dressed in a very expensive suit and wearing a smile that seemed unnaturally wide. He spoke at length about financial figures, profit margins, and his long-term vision for the project. His voice was as smooth and sweet as honey, but Celine was paying attention to other cues. Morrison would briefly lick his lips each time he mentioned investment capital, a classic sign of anxiety. His eyes would consistently dart to the right whenever he talked about projected earnings, a common indicator of creating information rather than recalling it. Most importantly, his right hand repeatedly went up to touch the collar of his shirt, a self-soothing gesture often seen when a person is being untruthful. The two men she did not recognize were entirely different. They sat perfectly still, their gaze locked onto Stellan, showing absolutely no interest in the details of the presentation. They were not there to discuss real estate. Their purpose was to evaluate and observe, and she could sense they were far more dangerous than Morrison. The meeting concluded after 1 hour and 30 minutes. Stellan did not make any commitment, stating only that he would consider the proposal and get in touch. Once all the guests had departed, he shut the heavy conference room door and turned his attention to Celine. "Your thoughts." Celine took a slow, deep breath to steady herself. "Morrison is lying," she started, her voice more confident than she felt. "He's lying about the investment numbers and the projected profits. He displays clear signs of anxiety any time money is the topic. I believe his entire project is in serious financial trouble. He has probably lost his other investors and is now desperate to find new capital." Stellan remained silent, simply watching her with his penetrating gaze. "His lawyers are aware that he is lying," Celine continued. "They deliberately avoid making eye contact whenever he starts to exaggerate the financial figures. But they do not correct him because their job is to remain quiet, not to expose the truth." "And the other two men?" Stellan prompted. Celine hesitated for just a beat. "They have no interest in the real estate deal. They were here for the sole purpose of evaluating you. They spent the entire meeting assessing your reactions, the way you spoke, and how you deliberately withheld a final decision. I do not know who they are, but they are extremely dangerous. The man with the salt and pepper hair is particularly noteworthy. He watched you as if he were actively searching for a weakness to exploit." There was a long silence. Stellan continued to study her, his expression completely unreadable. Then he did something that almost made Celine lose her balance. He smiled. It was not the cold, mocking smile she had seen from him before, but a genuine one. It was brief, but it was powerful enough to completely transform the harsh lines of his scarred face. "Morrison is on the verge of total bankruptcy." He confirmed that two of his major investors pulled their funding last month. "The man is desperate, and the other two men are, in fact, representatives from a Detroit Mafia family. They are trying to decide whether to propose an alliance or to declare a war. You read the entire situation perfectly." A profound wave of relief and pride washed over Celine, but she carefully kept it from showing on her face. "I had an excellent teacher," she replied, making sure to keep her tone completely professional. Stellan held her gaze for a long moment, and his eyes contained an emotion that Celine did not dare to identify. "You are a single mother," he said, his voice low. "You had to learn to read people because your very survival depended on it. That is the reason you are so good at this. That is the reason I chose you." As he turned and walked away, Celine became aware that her heart was beating much faster than normal. It was not a rhythm of fear, but of something else entirely. It was something she knew she should not allow herself to feel. An entire month went by, and Celine slowly adapted to the new cadence of her life. She grew accustomed to the high-stakes meetings, to analyzing people and deconstructing situations, to the constant presence of Stellan, and to the specific way he would look at her whenever her assessments proved to be correct. She even grew used to the brief, charged moments when their gazes would connect and hold for just a fraction longer than necessary. But this was something she could never get used to. That evening, Celine arrived back at her apartment much later than she normally did. A tense meeting with an investment group from Los Angeles had extended until almost 10 o'clock at night, and she was so bone-tired that all she wanted was to fall into her bed. But as she gently pushed open the apartment door, she heard it. It was a voice, singing in a low, warm tone, drifting softly from the direction of Fern's bedroom. Celine stopped dead in her tracks. She recognized that voice instantly. She had heard it command rooms full of powerful men. She had heard it turn icy cold when confronting his enemies. She had heard it soften to a gentle murmur when he spoke to Fern. But she had never, ever heard it sound like this. She began to move silently toward her daughter's room, feeling as if she were floating on air with each careful step. The bedroom door was slightly ajar, and through the narrow gap, she saw an image that made her heart physically stop in her chest. Stellan was sitting in the small rocking chair next to Fern's crib. The little girl was cradled safely in his powerful arms, and the gentle yellow glow from the nightlight enveloped them both like a delicate golden veil. And he was singing a lullaby to her in Italian. Celine could not understand the lyrics, but she did not need to. The melody itself conveyed everything she needed to know. It was a song of deep and profound love, beautiful and sorrowful at the same time. Stellan's voice was not technically perfect. It was a little rough on the higher notes, but it held a quality Celine had never heard from him before. It was filled with tenderness, with vulnerability, and with a deep sense of longing. Fern had been sound asleep for a while, her breathing slow and even, her small lips slightly parted. One of her tiny hands was curled tightly around Stellan's finger. Yet, he did not stop singing. He continued with his eyes closed, as if the song was not just for the sleeping child in his arms, but for someone else entirely, someone who was long gone. Celine remained frozen in the hallway, not daring to make a sound, not even daring to breathe. Warm tears began to stream down her face before she was even aware she was crying. These were not tears of sadness. She was crying because she was witnessing something deeply sacred, something that no one else in the world had likely ever seen. She was seeing the true soul of Stellan Cross. The song finally came to an end on a long, quiet note. Stellan opened his eyes, and in that unguarded moment, before he could erect his usual emotional walls, Celine saw it clearly, a deep and ancient pain that had never truly healed. Then he became aware of her presence. His eyes locked with hers through the small opening of the door, and for a long moment they both remained perfectly still. Celine expected him to be angry. She thought he would get up and leave the room without a single word, which was his usual reaction whenever anyone got too close. But he did not move. He simply held her gaze, and she saw his gray eyes soften in the dim light, in a way she had never witnessed before. "My mother used to sing this very song," he said, his voice low and raspy with emotion. "She sang it to me every single night, until the day she was no longer able to sing." Celine slowly pushed the door open the rest of the way and stepped into the room, feeling as if her legs were moving on their own. She quietly sat down on the floor next to his chair, close enough to reach out and touch him if she dared. "When did she pass away?" she asked in a soft whisper. "I was 12 years old," Stellan answered, his gaze dropping back down to Fern, his fingers beginning to unconsciously stroke the child's silky hair. "My father was the one who killed her. He beat her to death and he made me watch." A cold dread washed over Celine, freezing the blood in her veins. She desperately wanted to offer some comfort, but words felt useless. No combination of letters could possibly touch a wound that deep. "I tried to save her," Stellan's voice continued, sounding as if it came from a great distance. "I was only 12 years old, and I tried to push him away from her, but I was just a boy. I was not strong enough." His voice was hollow. "The only thing I could do was hold her as she slipped away. This song, It was the last thing she ever sang to me. Celine's tears began to fall more heavily, and she made no effort to hold them back. I am so sorry, she whispered, the words feeling small and inadequate. I am so, so sorry. Stellan finally looked at her, and in his gaze, she saw a profound sorrow she did not dare to name. You were never supposed to see this part of me, he said. No one should. Why not? She asked. Because it might make people believe I am a good man, he answered, his tone laced with bitterness. I am not a good man, Celine. I am a monster. I have taken more lives than you could possibly comprehend. Celine met his gaze, looking directly into those haunted, shadowed eyes, and spoke the one thing she knew to be true. Fern does not think you are a monster. She looks at you as if you are her entire world. And children are never wrong about a person's true nature. Stellan remained silent. He simply stared at her for a long, heavy moment that seemed to stretch into eternity. Then, he did something so unexpected, it made Celine's heart stop beating in her chest. He slowly lifted his hand and brushed the tears from her cheek. His touch was gentle, almost tender, as if he were handling something incredibly precious and fragile. You are crying too, he said, his voice a soft murmur. You are the first person who has cried for me in more than 20 years. In that instant, sitting on the floor of her daughter's bedroom with Stellan's fingers still resting against her skin, Celine realized the impossible truth. She loved him. She was in love with the monster, and she had no idea what to do with that revelation. They stayed like that in the quiet for a long time. Stellan eventually pulled his hand back, but he did not get up. He did not leave as she half expected him to. Instead, he looked down at Fern, the small child still sleeping peacefully in the safety of his arms, and he started to speak again. His voice was low and detached, as if he were reliving a memory from another lifetime. I had a sister, he said quietly. Her name was Thistle. Celine held her breath, not daring to move a muscle. She was terrified that if she shifted, or even breathed too loudly, the fragile moment would break, and he would fall silent again. She knew, with a deep certainty, that this was a story he had never shared with anyone before. She was born when I was 12, Stellan went on, his eyes still fixed on Fern's sleeping face. That was the same year my mother died. She gave birth to Thistle only 3 months before my father took her life. He paused, his jaw clenching so tightly, Celine could see the muscles twitching in his cheek as he fought for control. I think that is why he did it. He was consumed by jealousy. He could not stand that our mother loved us more than she ever loved him. He paused again. After she was gone, I raised Thistle myself. My father did not care about us. He was too busy building his criminal empire, too busy killing people and destroying lives. And so there I was, a 12-year-old boy, learning how to change diapers, how to mix formula from a can, and how to rock a crying baby to sleep. I sang my mother's song to her every single night. I swore to her that I would always protect her, that I would never let anything bad happen to her. His voice broke on the last words. Celine felt fresh tears spill over and run down her cheeks, but she did not bother to wipe them away. She just sat there, listening, acting as a silent witness to the immense pain he had carried alone for 2 decades. Thistle grew up, Stellan continued, a bitter, fleeting smile touching his lips. She had my mother's bright blue eyes. She was always smiling. She trusted everyone, even the people she should have feared. She was so much like Fern. He glanced down at the child in his arms, and Celine saw something inside him shatter completely. So much like her, that sometimes it was hard to breathe. What happened? Celine asked, her own voice barely a whisper. Stellan squeezed his eyes shut. When Thistle was 5, my father started a war with another Mafia family. He thought he was invincible. He was wrong. They came for us at night. I was 17 years old. I was downstairs when I heard the first gunshots. He stopped, his body rigid. When he opened his eyes again, they were shining with unshed tears. Celine had never seen him cry. She had not thought him capable of it. I was too late. He finally managed to say, his voice cracking like breaking glass. She was lying on her bed. There was blood everywhere. Her eyes were still open. She was looking toward the door, as if she was waiting for me to come and save her. But I did not get there in time. I promised her I would protect her. And I failed. Tears began to roll down Stellan's cheeks, and he made no move to wipe them away. He just sat there on the floor, holding Fern close, weeping silently for the sister he had lost 20 years ago. I held her all night long, he went on, his voice becoming distant again. I could not bring myself to let her go. I kept thinking that if I just held on tight enough, she would wake up. She would smile and say my name like she did every morning. But she never did. "And your father?" Celine asked, even though she was certain she already knew the answer. Stellan's eyes turned hard and dark. For the first time that night, she saw the ruthless man that all of Chicago feared. "I killed him," he said, his voice as cold as ice. It was 2 years after that night. I was 19. I spent those 2 years planning, making myself stronger, becoming ruthless enough to do what had to be done. Then I stabbed him with the very same knife he used to beat my mother. I stood there and watched him die, and I felt absolutely nothing. No regret, no fear, just emptiness. He turned to face Celine, his eyes a conflicting storm of ice and fire. That was the day I truly became a monster. That was the day a part of me died with Thistle, and I became the man you see before you. Celine reached out without thinking, and gently took his hand. Stellan looked down at her small fingers wrapped around his, as if he could not comprehend why she would still want to touch him after hearing everything he had just confessed. "You are not a monster," she said, her voice remaining steady despite her own tears. "You were a 12-year-old child forced to raise his baby sister all by himself. You were a brother who lost his sister while trying to defend her. You were a son who finally delivered justice for his mother and his sister. That is not a monster. That is a survivor." Stellan looked at her for a long, silent moment, and Celine saw something flicker deep within his eyes. It was not much. It was just a thin beam of light piercing through years of profound darkness. "Fern looks at me like I am a good man," he whispered. "She looks at me just like Thistle used to," he admitted, and his voice sounded like a final confession. "And I have no idea what I'm supposed to do with that." Celine's fingers tightened around his hand, a small anchor in the quiet room. "You just keep being the good man that Fern sees," she told him, her own voice soft but certain. "That is the only thing you need to do." In that space, surrounded by deep shadows and the gentle glow of a yellow lamp, Celine witnessed something she was sure no one else had ever seen. A single tear traced a path down the scarred cheek of Stellan Cross. In that moment, she understood with perfect clarity that it did not matter who he was or what terrible things he had done. She would never be capable of walking away from him. Then everything shattered on a Monday morning, just 2 weeks after Stellan had confessed the story of Thistle to her. She was in the office, carefully reviewing documents from their last meeting, when the door suddenly flew open. Kier charged into the room. Stellan's most trusted guard appeared as if he had just finished a frantic marathon. Sweat covered his forehead, his eyes were narrowed with extreme tension, and his jaw was locked tight. "The boss needs you, right now," Kier said, his voice sharp with urgency. Celine did not waste time with questions. She simply rose from her chair and followed him down the hall to Stellan's office. As she walked through the doorway, she found Stellan standing behind his massive desk. He was encircled by 5 men she knew were his most senior guards. The very air inside the room was thick with a tension so heavy it felt as if a knife could slice right through it. "Harlan Mercer," Stellan said, and his intense gaze locked with hers. The name fell into the oppressive silence like a grenade. Celine knew the name Harlan Mercer. Anyone with any connection to Chicago's criminal underworld knew him. He was the powerful Mafia boss from the South Side, and he was Stellan's most bitter and sworn enemy. Harlan's father was once an ally to Stellan's own father, a partnership that ended when Stellan murdered his own father to seize control of the entire empire. Harlan had vowed he would have his revenge. For 20 long years, he had remained quiet, patiently building his strength in the shadows. And now he is making his move, Keir stated, taking a step forward. Our informants confirm he has made contact with at least 3 other major Mafia families throughout the Midwest. They are in Detroit, Milwaukee, and Indianapolis. Every single one of them is now considering joining him in an alliance. To do what? Celine asked the question, though a cold dread told her she already knew the answer. To kill me, Stellan answered, his voice as cold and hard as steel. Harlan has no interest in my territory. He only wants me dead. His goal is to completely erase me and everything associated with me from the face of the earth. Celine felt the warmth drain from her body as her blood turned to ice in her veins. Everything associated with him. That meant her. That meant Fern. We are increasing all security measures, Stellan announced, his attention shifting to his guards. Double the patrols on the perimeter. Absolutely no one gets in or out without my direct approval. And I want guards posted at Celine and Fern's apartment. I want them there 24 hours a day. The guards gave a single, sharp nod and immediately filed out of the room to execute their orders. When they were the only 2 left, Celine moved toward Stellan. I need to leave, she said, her voice surprisingly steady despite the terror she felt. If Harlan is targeting the people close to you, then Fern and I cannot be here. We only make you an easier target. We are your weakness. No, Stellan said instantly, his voice cutting through the air like a razor. You are not going anywhere. Stellan, this is not the right time for an argument. He closed the distance between them. He stood so near that she could see every detail of the long scar on his face. So near she could feel the intense heat coming from his body. Where exactly do you believe you would be safer? He demanded. Out in the world by yourself with an 11-month-old baby? Or right here, inside the most heavily fortified estate in all of Chicago, protected by an entire army of men who are prepared to die for you? Celine desperately wanted to argue with him. She wanted to remind him that she had survived on her own for many years. But she knew deep down that he was right. She had no way to protect Fern from monsters like Harlan Mercer. She could not even guarantee her own safety. Why? She asked, her voice faltering as her resolve weakened. Why do you care so much about what happens to us? We are nothing to you. I am just a cleaner you hired from the streets. Why are you doing this? Because she looks at me as if I am a good man, Stellan interrupted fiercely. For the very first time, Celine heard an emotion other than cold command in his tone. Because you were the first person in 20 years to shed a tear for me. Because when I am with you and that child, he continued, I feel like maybe, just maybe, I am not a complete monster. He slowly raised his hand and gently touched her cheek, his touch as careful as it had been that night in Fern's nursery. You are not leaving, he stated, and his voice was somehow both a command and a desperate plea. You will stay here with me. You have to let me protect you and the child. Celine gazed into his burning gray eyes and realized she was unable to refuse him. It was not because she was afraid of him, but because she truly did not want to go. All right, she whispered in surrender. We will stay. And when Stellan pulled her into his arms, holding her as though she was the most precious and fragile thing in his entire world, Celine knew with absolute certainty that no matter what horrors came next, she would never regret making this choice. 3 days after that conversation, they discovered the mole. Keir found the anomaly while he was conducting a thorough review of all incoming and outgoing calls made from within the estate. An unauthorized, unfamiliar number appeared repeatedly in the communication logs, and it was traced directly to Corbin, one of the guards who had faithfully served Stellan for 8 years. There were encrypted text messages, calls made at unusual hours, and large sums of money being transferred into a secret offshore bank account. The evidence against him was undeniable and crystal clear. Celine was strictly forbidden from going anywhere near the basement, where they were holding Corbin. Stellan had ordered her to stay away, but she heard more than enough from Mrs. Thornberry, who had been trembling all morning after she had unintentionally walked past the basement door. The screaming, the older woman had whispered, her face completely drained of all its color. I have never in my life heard a man scream like that. Celine did not ask for any more details. She did not want to know the specifics. But when Stellan finally came back to the office later that afternoon, she saw the dark stains of blood on his sleeve. It was blood he had not even bothered to wash away. He stood with his back to her, staring out the window in silence for a full 10 minutes before he finally spoke. He confessed, Stellan said, his voice low and heavy with exhaustion. For 3 months. He has been selling information to Harlan for the last 3 months. Celine swallowed against the tightness in her throat. What did he tell him? Everything. Stellan turned to face her then, and Celine saw a darkness in his eyes that was deeper than anything she had seen before. My daily schedule, the details of my meetings, all of my business plans. He paused for a moment, his jaw tightening with fury. And he told him about you and the child. Celine's heart felt as if it were being squeezed in a vice. Harlan knows about us. He knows absolutely everything. Stellan began to walk toward her, and each step seemed heavy, as if he carried the weight of the entire world on his shoulders. He knows that you live here on this estate. He knows that Fern is my greatest weakness. He knows I would do anything in my power to protect both of you, and he fully intends to use that against me. A powerful surge of fear washed over Celine's chest. It was not fear for her own life. It was a primal fear for Fern. Her daughter was only 11 months old. She knew nothing about this violent underworld, nothing about brutal mafia wars, and nothing about men who would be willing to murder a child just to settle a score. What happened to Corbin? She asked, even though she was certain she already knew the answer. Stellan looked directly at her, and she saw not a single trace of regret in his eyes. He is no longer a concern. She gave a slow nod. She was not nearly as horrified as she had expected she would be. Perhaps it was because she had always known exactly who Stellan was from the very beginning. Or perhaps it was because she understood that in this brutal world, the price for betrayal was always paid in blood. Or maybe, just maybe, it was because when she imagined someone selling information about her daughter to a vicious enemy, she found that she felt no mercy at all for the traitor. I will protect you both, Stellan vowed, taking her hand in his. I give you my word. Even if it costs me my own life, I will never let Harlan get near you or the child. Celine looked deep into his eyes and saw the fiery resolve burning there. She knew he was telling the truth. She knew he would die to keep that promise. And that thought terrified her more than anything else in the world, because she did not want him to die. She could not bear the thought of losing him. Not now. Not when she felt like she had only just finally found him. Do not die for us, she said, her voice cracking with emotion. Live. You have to live for Fern. You have to live for me. Stellan stared at her for a long, silent moment, and she saw something soften in those steel-gray eyes. He did not say a word. He simply pulled her into his arms again, holding her tightly, as if he feared it might be their last time together. And as Celine stood there, held in the embrace of a man who had taken lives with his own 2 hands, she finally realized she was no longer afraid of him. Her only fear now was the thought of losing him. 1 week after Corbin's betrayal was handled, Stellan had to travel to Milwaukee for a crucial meeting with the local mafia bosses. The entire purpose of the meeting was to negotiate and stop them from forming an alliance with Harlan Mercer. Celine pleaded to go with him, but he flatly refused. It is far too dangerous, he had said. You will stay here where it is safe with Fern. I promise I will be back before midnight. She did not argue with him, but she also did not get any sleep. She sat rigidly in the living room of their apartment, her eyes glued to the front door, counting every agonizing minute as it slowly ticked by. 10 o'clock came and went, then 11 o'clock. There was no news at all. Her phone was clutched tightly in her hand, its screen remaining stubbornly dark. When the apartment door finally opened, it was nearly midnight. Celine instantly shot up from her seat. Stellan stepped inside, and her heart immediately plummeted into her stomach. There was blood on his shirt, a dark stain on the sleeve of his jacket, a smear on his neck, and a long, deep cut running the length of his left arm. Fresh blood was slowly seeping through the torn fabric of his shirt. Celine rushed over to him in a panic. "You are hurt. We need to get you to a hospital." "It is just a scratch," Stellan cut in, his voice thick with exhaustion. "The negotiation did not go as we had planned. One of their guards decided he needed to prove his loyalty by pulling a knife on me." He added grimly, "He is no longer alive to regret that decision." Celine did not care at all about the dead man. Her entire focus was on the man standing right in front of her, bleeding and acting as if everything was perfectly fine. "Sit down," she commanded, her voice coming out much firmer than she had intended. "Now." Stellan arched an eyebrow, clearly taken aback that she would dare to give him an order, but he did not protest. He sank down onto the sofa, watching her with eyes that were heavy with fatigue, and something else she was not yet brave enough to name. Celine hurried to the bathroom and grabbed the first aid kit before returning to his side. She sat down next to him, gently removing his jacket and then carefully tearing open the sleeve of his shirt so she could properly examine the wound. The gash was approximately 15 centimeters long. It was not dangerously deep, but it would definitely require stitches. Care. She focused completely on her task, cleaning the wounds with practiced motions, applying disinfectant, and wrapping fresh bandages. Her hands remained steady, a stark contrast to the frantic beating of her heart. The skills came from a different life, from a medical school she was forced to abandon long ago. She never imagined she would put them to use like this, especially not for the head of the Mafia. "You are a stubborn woman," Stellan's voice cut through the quiet room. Celine lifted her gaze to meet his. He was observing her with an intensity she had never seen from him before, an expression that was almost soft, almost gentle, as if he were looking at something incredibly precious. "I had a very good teacher," she managed to reply, fighting to keep her voice even as her pulse raced. Stellan offered no smile. He simply continued his search of her face, his gray eyes deep and unreadable. "You were worried about me," he stated. It was not a question but a fact. Celine paused her work and looked directly at him. "Of course I was worried," she admitted, her voice losing its edge. "Did you truly expect me not to be? Especially after you walked alone into a trap filled with your enemies? Why did you care?" "Because I care about you," Celine confessed, and for the first time in a long time, she made no effort to conceal her feelings. "Because our daughter Fern needs her father. Because I need you in my life. Because if anything were to happen to you, I honestly do not know how I would go on." A heavy silence filled the space between them. Stellan examined her for what felt like an eternity, long enough for a warm blush to rise in her cheeks. It was long enough for the cold tendrils of regret to start wrapping around her heart. Then, he raised his uninjured hand and gently touched her face, his touch as careful as it was the first time he entered Fern's room. "I should not be doing this," he whispered, and Celine could feel the warmth of his breath just before his lips met hers. "A person like you deserves so much better than a man like me." "I do not care about what I deserve," Celine answered, her voice trembling with emotion. "Let me be the one to decide that." And then he kissed her with a softness and a caution, as if she were made of glass. His lips were warm and gentle against hers, and Celine felt the entire world simply melt away. In that moment, there was only him and her, together in an apartment bathed in golden light, the lingering scent of blood and antiseptic, a strange perfume in the air. When he finally pulled away, he rested his forehead against hers, his gray eyes gazing into hers with an emotion she finally dared to give a name. It was love. "I will protect you," he vowed in a whisper. "I will protect you with my very life." And Celine, with a heart that felt ready to burst from her chest, pulled his face back to hers and kissed him again. This kiss was not gentle. This one was filled with all the longing, all the desperation, and all the feelings she had kept locked away for so long. She did not need him to die for her. She needed him to live, and to hold her just like this. To live, and to kiss her with this much passion. To live, and to look at her as if she was the center of his entire universe. Everything changed on a Tuesday night, exactly 3 days after they first kissed. Celine was in Stellan's office, carefully reviewing a stack of contracts he had asked her to analyze. Fern was safely asleep in their apartment, with the watchful Miss Hayashi standing guard. Stellan was seated behind his massive desk, his gray eyes locked on his laptop screen, but she noticed how he would look up at her every few minutes. They were brief glances, followed by faint smiles that appeared and disappeared in an instant. They were small, private moments that only the two of them could ever understand. The last 3 days had felt like living inside a beautiful dream. To the rest of the world, Stellan was still Stellan, a cold and utterly ruthless figure of power. But with her, he was an entirely different man. It was in the light brush of his fingers against hers as they passed in the corridor. It was in a stolen kiss inside an empty hallway when no one was looking. It was in a look filled with profound tenderness when he thought she was not paying attention. Celine had no idea what they were really doing or where any of this was heading. All she knew for certain was that she never wanted it to end. She was happy. For the first time in so many years, she was genuinely and completely happy. And that was precisely the moment her world shattered into a million pieces. The sound came first, a piercing whistle that tore through the evening air, like the sound of death taking a final breath. Then the enormous floor-to-ceiling glass wall of the office exploded. Shards of glass rained into the room like a hailstorm of daggers. Celine screamed, a raw and instinctive sound, throwing her arms up to protect her face. She was not fast enough. Stellan launched himself over the desk, his body crashing into hers, knocking her down to the floor and shielding her with his own. She felt the sharp sting as glass sliced into his back. She heard the sound of expensive fabric tearing and felt his entire body go rigid with pain, but he refused to move. He only held her tighter, pulling her closer and lowering his head until his mouth was right next to her ear. "Stay completely still," he hissed, his voice tight with agony. "Do not make a single move." Suddenly, the night erupted with gunfire. It was not a single shot, but dozens of them, coming from outside, from the courtyard far below, and seemingly from every direction at once. The sounds of screams, panicked footsteps, and revving engines filled the air. The entire estate was under a coordinated attack. Stellan pulled his phone from his pocket and dialed a number without even looking. Hayashi. His voice was as cold as ice, despite the warm blood now running down his back. "Lock down the safe room immediately. Protect the child with your life." He hung up and looked down at Celine, his gray eyes blazing with a fierce light in the darkness. "Listen to me very carefully," he said in a low, urgent tone. "You are going to crawl to that door. You are going to run straight back to the apartment. You will go into the safe room with Fern. The code is 0815. Do you understand me? Can you remember it?" Celine nodded, her heart pounding against her ribs like a trapped bird. "But what is going to happen to you?" "I will handle this situation," Stellan replied. And as he lifted his head, a gun seemed to materialize in his hand as if from thin air. "Go now! I cannot just leave you here by yourself," Celine pleaded, her voice shaking uncontrollably. "I absolutely cannot." "Yes, you can," Stellan interrupted, his intense gaze locking with hers. "You will do it for Fern. She needs you right now. She cannot afford to lose her mother." Fern. The name of her daughter was a sharp blade that cut through the thick fog of her panic. Her baby was in the apartment. She must be so scared. She needed her mother to be with her. "Go," Stellan repeated, and this time his voice softened, becoming as gentle as it was whenever he spoke to Fern. "I will find you when this is over. I give you my word." Celine desperately wanted to say more. She wanted to tell him that she loved him, that he had to survive this, that she could not bear the thought of losing him now. But there was absolutely no time. The gunfire was getting closer. The screams were spreading like a virus through the estate. And Stellan was already rising to his feet, his back a canvas of blood, the gun held firmly in his hand as he moved toward the shattered remains of the window. She heard his voice ring out with authority into the chaotic darkness, cold and lethal, completely stripped of any trace of the man who had kissed her just 3 nights ago. You have all just made the final and most costly mistake of your lives. Then the gunfire thundered again, and Celine scrambled for the door, hot tears streaming down her face, her heart shattering as she was forced to leave him behind. She ran through the long corridors, sharp pieces of glass cutting into the soles of her feet, her own blood marking a trail on the polished marble floor. She did not care about the pain. Her thoughts were only of Fern, of Stellan, and of the promise he had made. I will find you later. He had to keep that promise. He simply had to live. Because if he died tonight, she did not know how she could ever find the strength to go on living at all. Celine ran with a desperation she had never known in her entire life. The corridor seemed to stretch on for an eternity, the overhead lights flickering erratically as the estate's power system struggled under the assault. Gunshots echoed from all around her, screams tore through the air, followed by the sounds of more glass breaking and bodies hitting the ground. The once peaceful estate had been transformed into a bloody battlefield. She finally turned into the correct hallway. It was the one leading to the east wing, where her apartment and her daughter were waiting. 50 meters to go, then 40, then 30. Then she froze in her tracks, as if she had run into an invisible wall. 2 men completely blocked the corridor ahead of her. They were dressed in black tactical gear, their faces hidden by masks, and they were holding guns aimed directly at her. There she is, one of the men said, his voice thick with a smug satisfaction. That is the prize the boss wants us to collect. The blood in Celine's veins turned to ice. She took one step back, and then another, but she realized there was no place to run. Behind her was nothing but the long, empty corridor she had just fled. In front of her stood 2 killers sent by Harlan Mercer. She was completely and utterly trapped. Take her now, the second man commanded his partner. Remember, the boss wants her alive and breathing. They began to advance on her slowly. Celine knew in that instant she had to do something. She could not allow them to take her. She could not let them use her as a weapon against Stellan. She absolutely could not let Fern lose another parent. Her eyes darted around the hallway, searching desperately for anything she could possibly use as a weapon. A decorative vase, a heavy picture frame, anything at all. But before she could make a move, a dark shadow exploded from the hallway behind her. It was Stellan. He moved with the silence of a ghost, impossibly fast and lethal. Before the 2 armed men could even process what was happening, he was already between them. He delivered a vicious punch to the first man's throat. The man collapsed, gagging for air, his gun clattering loudly on the marble floor. The second assassin fired a wild shot, but Stellan twisted his body, and the bullet only grazed his shoulder. He then grabbed the gunman's arm and wrenched it with brutal force. A dry, sickening crack echoed in the corridor as the bone snapped. A scream was torn from the man's throat before being cut short as Stellan used their own weapon to finish them both. 2 precise shots, 2 bodies slumping to the floor. The entire violent encounter was over in less than 10 seconds. Celine stood there trembling, unable to fully comprehend what she had just witnessed. She had always been aware that Stellan was a dangerous man. She had always known deep down that he was a killer. But seeing it happen with her own eyes was a completely different reality. He was brutal. He was merciless. He was death itself wearing the skin of a man, and he had just killed 2 people without hesitation to protect her. Go, Stellan commanded, his voice perfectly steady despite his injuries. He grabbed her hand tightly and pulled her into a desperate run. Fresh blood was now streaming from his shoulder and his back, but he did not slow down for even a second. They raced through the corridors, running past the bodies of fallen men scattered across the floor, past growing pools of blood that were still warm on the cold marble. Celine refused to look. She kept her eyes fixed on Stellan's broad back, on the powerful hand that gripped hers, and she just ran. When they finally reached their apartment, the door was already standing open. Miss Hayashi was inside, holding a gun in each hand, her expression shockingly calm amid the chaos. "Where is Fern?" Stellan demanded without preamble. "She is in the safe room," Hayashi replied evenly. "She is sound asleep. I administered a very mild sedative to keep her calm." Stellan immediately shoved Celine toward the heavy steel door built into the back wall of the apartment. "The code," he reminded her urgently. With fingers that trembled violently, Celine punched in the 4 numbers she now knew by heart. 0815. The heavy door unlatched with a solid, reassuring click. Inside the small room, Fern was lying on a little bed, her eyes closed, her breathing slow and even. She had absolutely no idea about the terrifying nightmare that was unfolding just outside her sanctuary. "Keep them outside. They must not see any of this blood, this death, this violence." Celine scrambled to her daughter's side, clutching her tightly as tears of terror streamed down her face. Miraculously, Fern slept on, completely still. "Inside," Stellan commanded Hayashi. "Protect them." "And what about you?" Hayashi asked, her voice tight with concern. "I have work to do." Stellan turned back to Celine. For one fleeting moment, the frozen mask on his face melted completely away. All that was left was the man who had sung Fern to sleep, the man who had kissed her under the warm glow of a yellow light, the man who had looked at her as if she was his entire universe. "I will come back," he said, his voice low and certain. "I promise you." Then the heavy steel door clanged shut, and Celine could only sit on the floor holding her daughter, listening to the horrifying sounds of gunfire erupting outside, and pray. "Please let him live," she whispered into Fern's soft, clean hair. "Please let him come back to us." 20 minutes passed, but each one felt like 20 years. Every gunshot was a sharp knife stabbing into Celine's heart. Every distant scream felt like a curse. She had no way of knowing what was happening beyond that solid steel door. No idea if Stellan was alive or dead. No idea if the safe room would hold against an assault. All she could do was pray, and wait, and hold her child. Then, the silence descended suddenly. One moment there was gunfire, shouting, and complete chaos. The next, there was nothing. Only a thick, heavy quiet that pressed down on Celine's chest like a block of lead. She remained in the corner of the safe room with Fern still cradled in her arms, her eyes glued to the steel door. Ms. Hayashi stood guard in front of it, her guns still raised, her posture alert and ready for anything. No one spoke. No one dared to even breathe too loudly. Then they heard footsteps. They were slow, heavy, and deliberately approaching their location. Celine tightened her grip on Fern, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She did not know who was on the other side. She did not know if it was Stellan returning or one of his enemies coming to finish the job. She did not know whether that door would open to her salvation or her death. 3 distinct knocks echoed against the thick steel. Then a voice called out, low, hoarse, and utterly exhausted, but it was alive. "Open the door. It is me." Celine broke down completely before she even realized she was sobbing. She gently placed Fern on the small bed and scrambled forward, her fingers trembling as she worked the lock. The door creaked open, revealing Stellan. He was a vision from a nightmare. A thick layer of blood coated nearly every inch of him, staining his shirt, his face, and his hands, matting his dark hair. A deep gash across his forehead was weeping blood that ran down into one of his eyes. His shoulder was a ruin of torn fabric and exposed, raw muscle. The expensive suit he wore was now nothing more than a collection of tattered rags. Yet, he was on his feet. He was taking breaths. He was alive. It was Stellan. Celine launched herself into his embrace, completely ignoring the blood. Nothing mattered except the solid feel of him, the confirmation that he was real, that he was here. He had kept his promise to come back. Stellan's arms locked around her with a desperate force that squeezed the air from her lungs. His whole body was trembling, not from the chill or his wounds, but from an emotion she had never witnessed in him. "I am so sorry," he rasped into her hair, his voice cracking with emotion. "I am so sorry. This world is mine. This danger is mine. This is all my fault. You never should have been forced to endure this. Fern never should have." Celine gently placed her fingertips against his lips to quiet him. "We are both safe. You made sure we were protected. You are the reason we were saved, but I am the one who put you in this position." "No, you did not," Celine insisted. "Harlan Mercer was the one who put us in danger, and I have a strong feeling that he is no longer a concern." For a fleeting instant, Stellan's eyes turned to cold, hard stone. "No," he confirmed. "He is no longer a concern." His expression then softened as his gaze shifted to the small bed across the room. Fern was awake. The little girl sat up, her wide blue eyes fixed on the blood-covered man who stood in the frame of the door. Soline's heart seized with fear, certain that Fern would be terrified. She expected her to scream at the sight of him in this state, covered in blood and wounds, with the very shadow of death clinging to his form. But Fern did not cry out. Instead, she carefully climbed down from the bed. She began to toddle directly toward Stellan, her small arms reaching upward, asking to be held. Despite his bleeding arm, despite the bone-deep exhaustion pulling at his every muscle, Stellan bent down and gently lifted her into his arms. Fern wrapped her arms around his neck just as she always did, resting her cheek against his shoulder. Then she leaned back, her tiny face creased with concern as she stared at the cut on his forehead. And then, she said a word. "Aoi." It was a single word, spoken with perfect clarity. It was Fern's very first word. Celine stood completely still. Miss Hayashi froze beside her. It felt as if the entire world had paused on its axis. Fern reached out and delicately touched the bleeding wound on Stellan's forehead. She was so gentle, so careful, as if she was terrified of causing him more pain. "Owie," she repeated, her small voice thick with worry. "Hurt?" Stellan looked down at the child he was holding, and in that moment, Celine saw something she had believed was impossible. Tears were streaming down the face of Stellan Cross. The man who had likely ended more lives than she could ever comprehend that night was weeping. He was crying because a baby, who was just 11 months old, had just spoken her first word to him. "Her first word," he whispered, his voice completely broken by emotion. "Her first word is owie." "Owie," Fern said again, patting his cheek softly, trying her best to offer him comfort. "Owie." Stellan pulled her closer, his eyes squeezed shut as the tears continued their silent path down his cheeks. He made no effort to hide them. He did not try to project an image of strength. He just stood there, a bloodied and broken man, holding a child who was not his own, but who loved him with a pure and unconditional heart. And he wept. "I am okay, little one," he whispered to her. "I am okay now." Celine moved toward them and wrapped her arms around them both. They stood together in the cold steel of the safe room, the air thick with the metallic scent of blood and gunpowder, as the first faint wail of sirens began to echo in the distance. They were a family, shattered and blood-soaked and far from perfect, but they were a family nonetheless. "Stay with me," Stellan said, his voice sounding like a prayer. "Both of you, please. Just stay with me. Let me be the one who protects you. Let me be the one who loves you. Let me become something more than just a monster." Celine tilted her face up to meet his, looking deep into his eyes, which were filled with tears and profound pain, but also with a delicate, fragile hope. "You already are," she told him softly. "You have been for a very long time. You were just the last one to see it." Fern tightened her tiny arms around both of their necks, as if she was promising to never let go. "Owie," she said one more time, and then a bright smile broke across her face. "All better." And though Celine had no idea where Fern had learned that phrase, or how she could possibly understand its meaning, she knew with absolute certainty that Fern was speaking directly to Stellan. It is painful now, but everything is going to be all right. Everything will be fine. 6 months later, a Chicago summer was glowing with golden sunlight and cooled by a gentle breeze. The vast gardens of the Cross estate were blooming with countless roses and fragrant lavender, their sweet scent drifting lazily through the warm air. Soline stood on the veranda, taking in a peaceful scene that only 6 months ago she would have never dared to imagine could be part of her life. "She is running," Soline called out, a brilliant smile lighting up her entire face. Fern, now 17 months old, was making her way across the perfectly manicured green lawn. Her tiny legs were a little wobbly, but her steps were filled with a fierce determination. Two small braids bounced happily with each movement she made. Her pure, clear laughter echoed in the air like the sound of delicate wind chimes. The frail, pale child was gone. Her cheeks now had a rosy, healthy glow. Her eyes shone with an incredible zest for life. The proper care she had received had transformed her health completely. "I have got you now." Stellan suddenly emerged from behind a large rose bush, bending down to scoop a giggling fern into his arms. He spun her around in a joyful circle through the air, and Fern's laughter exploded into a sound of pure delight. It was the most beautiful sound Soline had ever heard in her life. Today, Stellan was dressed in simple jeans and a plain white shirt, a stark contrast to the expensive suits he typically wore for his meetings. The scar on his face was a permanent reminder of their past. The wound on his forehead had healed into a thin, pale line, but the true change was in his eyes. They were no longer cold as ice, no longer empty like a dark abyss. Now, there was a light inside them. There was life. There was an abundance of love. "Daddy!" Fern shouted with glee, patting her hands on Stellan's cheeks. "Daddy! Daddy! Daddy!" Stellan went perfectly still. Even after hearing that word for the past month, ever since Fern had first started calling him that, he never seemed to grow accustomed to it. Each time she said it, it hit him with the same force. Each time, a shimmer of emotion would appear in his eyes. Each time, he held her just a little more tightly. "She calls me Dad," he said quietly to Celine as she walked over to join them. "She calls me Dad. That is because you are her dad," Celine answered, wrapping her own arms around them both. "You are her father in every single way that truly matters." Stellan looked at her then, and his gaze contained everything he could not bring himself to say out loud. There was gratitude, there was love, there was absolute devotion, and there was a silent vow that he would protect them both until he took his very last breath. He was, of course, still Stellan Cross. He remained the ghost who held dominion over Chicago's criminal underworld, a man who was still dangerous, still utterly ruthless to his enemies. But to the two women he held in his arms, he had become someone entirely different. He was a father, he was a lover, he was a man who was finally learning how to truly live after 20 long years of merely existing. Fern clapped her small hands against both Stellan and Celine, a wide grin spreading across her face. Daddy, Mommy, love, three incredibly simple words. But within those three words, they had found their entire world. They all laughed, the three of them, standing together in that sun-drenched garden, holding on to one another, just laughing. They were a family that was not forged by blood, but one that was built by choice, by love, and by the powerful belief that every single person is deserving of being saved. Sometimes the brightest light can emerge from the darkest of places. Sometimes salvation arrives in the small, trusting hands of a child. And sometimes monsters do not need to be slain. They just need to be loved. Today's story has reached its conclusion, but the message it carries will endure. In our lives, it can happen that the people who appear to be the most dangerous are actually the ones who are in the greatest need of love. Sometimes, hearts that we believe have been dormant for years can be brought back to life by the trusting gaze of a young child. And sometimes, we discover our true family in the most unexpected of places and with the most unexpected people. If this story has resonated with you, we warmly invite you to subscribe to our channel, give this video a like, and please share it so that more people can experience meaningful stories each and every day. We would love to know how this story made you feel. Have you ever known someone who seemed cold and distant on the surface, but was hiding a wonderfully warm heart inside? Please feel free to share your own experiences with us in the comment section below. We genuinely look forward to reading the thoughts that come from your heart. Thank you so much for joining us until the very end of the video. We wish everyone listening good health, a life filled with joy, and many peaceful, happy days spent with the people you hold dear. Goodbye for now, and we hope to see you again in our next video. This content was carefully researched, developed, and manually edited by our team to bring you meaningful stories and valuable life lessons. Thank you for being part of our journey.